autism spectrum disorder. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Ms. Susan Stokes. Okay, wow, we did double in size, as Tammy said, once we got all the elementary folks in here. I'm very happy to be here this morning, and I'm very happy to be presenting to your entire school district. I always say the more folks that understand these students, the biggest difference it's going to make in their lives. So very happy I get 2 hours this morning to share information about ASD. As Tammy had said, I'm a speech language pathologist by trade, but I've been in the field of autism for 30 years. In my current position, I work as an educational autism consultant. So what that means is my everyday working life, if I'm not doing a training or one of these professional development instances, I'm out in schools. And I'm providing support services to students who have been identified with autism spectrum disorder, but more importantly, I'm providing support services to you all, to the educational teams that support these students and the families as well. I always give my disclaimer when I do trainings. My everyday working life is autism, lots of experience, but I never ever feel like I'm an autism expert. In fact, there are times when I've had people introduce me, our autism expert is here today, and I'm always quick to correct and say I'm not an autism expert, I'm the autism support person or the autism consultant. And the reason being, I've worked with so many of these students every single day of my working life, and I want you to know I learn something from every single one of these students that I work with. And some of these students, they teach me an awful lot. So I never go into this thinking I'm the expert and I got all of the answers here. And the reason I share this, there may be days when you all are trying to figure out this kiddo so desperately. You might be beating your head against the wall trying to figure this student out. And there might be days I might be right there with you, or beating my head trying to figure this student out. It's the whole reason the national symbol for autism is the puzzle piece. I mean, there could be no more appropriate symbol for autism than the puzzle piece. Because these students are puzzles, and some of them are very complicated, complex puzzles, absolutely. I've heard professionals say before, if you've worked with one student with ASD, you've worked with one student with ASD. And those of you that are nodding your head, you have worked with more than one. All right, you know exactly what I'm talking about here. So this morning, in the 2 hours that I have to share with you all, I'm going to give you, first of all, just a brief understanding of autism spectrum disorder, the unique way that these students learn, think, process, because that will absolutely impact how you instruct them, and it will also impact how you understand how they're presenting to you, and what might be some changes that you want to put in place that would be, as Tammy said, positive behavioral interventions and support. And at the very end, I'll share with you some techniques, some tips, some intervention strategies very specific to these students for programming. So I think handouts, they have like the ability to download electronic versions, right? So you all, if you brought it, great. If not, you've got an electronic version that should match up pretty well to my PowerPoint. So jumping into this. First thing, I feel like I say this almost every day when I'm out in schools or reminding folks of this. If you have a student in your classroom that's been identified with an autism spectrum disorder, first and foremost, you need to keep in mind this child has a neurological developmental disability, a brain-based developmental disability. Their brains are wired differently, and there is research to support this. Autism is a neurological processing disorder. How their brain processes social information, sensory information, communication can be very different than you or I or the other students in your classroom. Now, people tend to have no problem keeping this fact in mind when they have a student with autism that's identified with more so what I call the classic autism. That would be the student that might be not a real functional verbal communicator. They might engage in a lot more of the repetitive kinds of behaviors. People tend to get it right off the bat. Okay, this child, there's something a bit different, possibly something going on neurologically. But when you have a student in your class that is highly verbal, and could be highly intelligent. I mean, I have some students, their IQs are up in the 150 range. And they are using 20-word sentences and using vocabulary words I don't don't even know what they're talking about. It's very easy to lose sight of this fact, that they still have a neurological, brain-based developmental disability that is going to impact them in a number of different ways that I will share with you in just a minute here. So keep this in mind, because if you have one of those verbal, cognitively intact students, oftentimes we get so hung up on the fact, well, they're smart, all right, so, you know, if they're struggling, if they're having a meltdown because they missed one on a math test, it can't be autism because this student's really smart. You know, he's just overreacting. All right, here, he's just doing this on purpose. He's smart enough, he should know better. IQ has nothing to do with your ability to process and understand, again, social information, sensory information, figurative language, abstract elements of language, of academics. And again, I'll talk more about that. So I just want to make that point real clear. Causation of autism spectrum disorder, this has been like so argumentative in the world of autism for so many years now. You know, what researchers do agree upon, it is a genetic-based developmental disability. Babies are not born without anything wrong, and then there's some kind of environmental insult that causes autism. We have finally linked the vaccination as a causation factor to rest. All right, so, and the reason we know there's this genetic piece is because they have discovered chromosomal abnormalities in varying combinations. So again, genetic, the underlying causation factor for autism spectrum disorder. If you have a student that's been identified with ASD, they will be impacted in 3 primary areas for sure, because these are the 3 diagnostic criteria. So they will definitely struggle in the area of social relations to some depth and degree. They will definitely struggle in the area of communication. And communication is just not, you know, can you talk or can you not talk? Because I said before, I have many students that are highly, highly verbal, but they talk at me, not with me. All right, they engage in monologues, you know, they're just kind of like verbally spewing all this information, but we're not engaged in a reciprocal back and forth conversation. So they struggle tremendously in this area of communication from a social communication perspective. And then the third primary area, we call it restrictive, repetitive, perseverative patterns of behavior. These are kiddos that can get stuck on things, you know, have certain things that they absolutely love, have a difficult time shifting, might have a difficult time with change, like predictability. And I'll talk a bit more about these 3 areas, a bit more in depth, a little bit later this morning. But what is important to keep in mind is that autism is now considered a spectrum disorder. It does look a lot different than it did before. When I got in the field 30 years ago, the students that I was working with 30 years ago that were identified as having autism, those were the students that were very socially withdrawn, and I always heard the cliche, it's like they're in their own little world, engaged in a lot of repetitive kinds of behaviors, and they weren't very functional verbal communicators. I still work with those students, but I work with students that also look a lot different than that. So autism has changed greatly just in the 30 years that I've been in the field. And I think this slide definitely speaks to the continuum of what we can see in our students with ASD. You know, their IQ, their cognitive functioning. I have some students that are cognitively at a very young level. But again, I have some students, you know, that could be all the way up in that 150 range. And I've got everything in between. Regarding their social relation skills, I had just said primary area of difficulty. But how they present socially can vary greatly from student to student. I've had some students that are very socially withdrawn, very socially aloof. And those are the students that oftentimes people will describe, it's like they're in their own little world. I've had some students that have been so socially withdrawn, they don't even recognize people as people. People are more so like objects in their environment. I was in a classroom and I was sitting between 2 areas of this classroom, and the student with autism wanted to get to the other side, and they literally climbed over the top of me. I mean, like I was a piece of furniture in the classroom. It wasn't like they came over and kind of like, nudged me and kind of looked at me like, come on, person, get out of the way. I was truly a piece of furniture in that classroom. So on this end of, the social continuum, they might be way down here. But I also have students socially that have a strong desire to engage in social interactions, and they are like trying to jump into every social situation they can. Strong drive, strong desire, but they're having problems. They're struggling. Why? Because they have this desire, yet they don't have those skills to be successful in that social interaction. And again, despite having a high IQ or being highly verbal, all right, despite that. Communication, I have students that are not functional verbal communicators, and then I have the students that talk their arm and leg off. Motor skills, and I know my OTs, my PTs, and my Phy Ed teachers can definitely speak to this, where they've seen with these students a broad continuum of how their motor skills can present. Some of these students, their gross motor skills, their fine motor skills, they might struggle. They might be motorically awkward. They might require occupational therapy or adaptive Phy Ed. But some of these other students, this might be their strength area, where they can be incredibly agile in this motor area. And then the last area that I have listed up here, where we can see such a broad continuum, in the area of sensory processing. Our brains, all of us, 24/7, our brains are processing incoming sensory information from our 7 different sensory areas. You just don't have 5 people, you have 7. And our brains are trying to interpret it and figure out, do we need to respond to it? Do we need to not? Tell us what it is. Is it too loud? Is it too soft, etc.? And for our students with ASD, because it is a neurological processing disorder, their brains typically struggle with processing this incoming sensory information accurately. So the brain can send out erroneous messages. So there might be a very soft humming sound. You guys can hear that right now? Some of you might. All right, this has been going on, people, while you've been in here. But your brain has been processing that, saying, oh, it's auditory stimulation. Your brain is saying, it's really soft, it's not painful, it's not a threat to your safety. And your brain is saying, it must be coming from some ventilation system. It's no big deal. Don't pay attention to it. Now, you don't have to make a conscious effort to do that. Your brain is doing all of that for you. But with students with ASD, neurologically, their brains might interpret that number 1 as, oh my gosh, what is that? It's extremely loud. It's very painful. I think it is possibly a threat to your safety. You need to get out of here. All right, and I've had students that will take off running, all right, because of something like this. And it's not that they are being drama kings or queens or overreacting. It's how the response neurologically that their brain is putting them into due to this sensory stimulation. The brain has like misread this sensory stimulation. Does that make sense to everybody? So this is real. This is extremely real, people. So autism is what I call a spectrum disorder. It's not just the picture that everyone had from a few years ago of Rain Man, all right? It's like everybody thought Rain Man was autism. If you didn't fit the Rain Man profile, then this person must not have autism. I was doing a talk, and there were like a lot of brand new teachers, I mean, like we're talking like 20s, low 20s, and I talked about Rain Man, and I saw so many blank faces. And I'm like, man, I am so old. Like, these 20-year-olds don't even know who Rain Man is. So let me show you real quick. 3 of my students, actually. 2 are identical twins. And the twins have classic autism, all right? They are not real functional verbal communicators. You're going to hear vocalizations from them. You're going to see some repetitive behaviors. And then the second clip is a young man who also has autism spectrum disorder, but presents very differently from these twins. Uh-oh, you guys, Kyle's getting into his lunch. Is he supposed to?
What do you think is most important for teachers to know, like about kids that have Asperger's syndrome?
Well, there's a lot of things we think is really important, like the homework. So we like they're kind of late. We like that they can be kind of laid back, not too high stressful. Like they don't really push us really fast. That gets us kind of anxious.
Okay.
And I mean with a lot of kids with autism, we like people with sense of humor. A lot of the teachers that I find it hard to have a sense of humor, so that's nice.
Okay, so when you look at this video clip, those three young men, you would probably think, well, gosh, those twins, they must, their autism is very apparent. They must really struggle the most. Because when you look at the second video clip of my friend, you'd be probably hard-pressed on the surface, right, to pick out that there isn't anything going on with this student. His voice sounds very nice. I have some verbal students that, you pick up there's something a little different because they might talk like this. You don't hear like inflectional changes, kind of robotic. Alex doesn't speak like that. He's got the inflectional changes. He's funny, he was making jokes in there. So on the surface, I'm sure you're thinking, his autism, he must just have a little bit, all right, just a little bit, because he looks so good. And this happens all the time. I'll tell you, the twins have actually not struggled near as much as what Alex has in school, because Alex was very misunderstood and misprogrammed for because he looks so good on the surface. So many of Alex's behaviors were misperceived as very purposeful. He's doing this on purpose. We're going to put him on a point system, and he has to, very compliance-based was his program. Not looking at the behaviors he's exhibiting are because he doesn't have skills in these areas. And if we don't teach him these skills, all right, he's going to continue to exhibit these behaviors. He struggled significantly with something called social cognition or perspective taking. And he would say the rudest, most disrespectful things. And it wasn't that he was purposely trying to be rude and disrespectful. He gets a thought, or he used to get a thought up here, and it would come right out of his mouth, all right? He wouldn't consider, how might this impact another person? What might they be thinking about me if I say, this is stupid, this is really dumb? And if I tell the teacher, this is the most boring thing I've ever had to do in my entire life. Why do we have to do this, all right? Teachers didn't take real kindly to those sorts of comments. So Alex would, of course, get 0, 0, 0, 0 on his point sheet. Every day, 0 points, every day. But what they didn't take into consideration is that he has no clue about perspective taking, how his actions and behaviors make other people feel. He's not able to put himself in the shoes of someone else, understand other people think differently from him. And he needed to be taught those skills when he was calm, using a curriculum-based approach, just like he was taught to read. And he's a highly intelligent young man, very highly intelligent. So that's why it was so easy to misperceive, his skill deficits. Another area that he struggled in tremendously was self-regulation. Alex has and still has a lot of anxiety. And his anxiety would build over the course of the school day until he would go into what I would call a meltdown mode. And his meltdowns could look like lots of different things. My fear not only for him, but for many of my students that don't have self-regulation skills, that they're going to end up in jail. And I kid you not. That is my biggest fear. Because if they're 18 and they're engaging in property destruction or physical acts of aggression towards someone else, they're going to end up in jail, people. Before 18, they can get to the juvenile system, So these students, many of them, do not know how to recognize those signs of anxiety that are building. And they have a great deal more anxiety than anyone else because of the neurological features and characteristics of autism. So many of these students need to be taught, again, when they're calm, self-regulation skills, how to bring themselves back down. So often, we impose regulation upon them, but that's not self-regulation. Self is the key, and self is what's going to make them independent and successful long-term in life. And definitely keep in mind, IQ is not the best determiner of school ability and functioning. But I think so often we do get caught up on how smart somebody might be, and that's, kind of, we put all of our weight on that, and we think, oh, the struggles can't be, related to autism because they're too smart, they should know better. And truly, for, I would say, many of these students, their autism spectrum disorder is a hidden disability. And I think absolutely Alex is testimony to that. Few miscellaneous stats. Autism spectrum disorder, spectrum, it occurs in 1 in 68 births now. This is the latest stat from the CDC. I can remember when I did trainings years ago, I can remember saying 1 in 10,000. I can then remember saying 1 in 5,000. I said 1 in 5,000 for a long time. Then we got down to 1 in 1,000, and we seem to be stuck there for a long time. As recently as like about a year and a half ago, it was 1 in 110, and now we're down to 1 in 68. Hold on to the thought that you're all having. Why is this happening? All right, what's going on? There is a higher incident rate in males than females, and I'm sure if I kind of like even looked at the stats here, in your school district, I bet there's a higher percentage of males versus females. And that kind of goes back to that genetic piece as well, all right? Oftentimes, the X chromosome is a chromosome that is involved, all right? And we know what makes a boy a boy, what makes a girl a girl, with XX, XY. Autism spectrum disorder is considered right now the fastest growing developmental disability in the United States. Which brings us to the $64 million question. All right, why are we seeing so many more of these kiddos in school? Those of you that have been in schools for as long as I have, I'm sure you're thinking, okay, 30 years ago, I hardly ever had a student in my class with autism, especially you gen ed teachers. And now you're thinking, it's like every year I'm getting a student with autism. What is going on? There has to be something in the water, or there has to be something that's causing this increase that we're seeing, especially again, educationally, because it is impacting us very much so educationally. Well, I can tell you a couple of reasons why we're seeing this increase. The biggest reason of all is the labeling system for autism has changed in 30 years. It's changed both medically and educationally. When I got in the field 30 years ago, the medical criteria for autism was, the people had to be very significantly, severely involved to receive that label of autism. All right, very severely, significantly involved. That was the criteria the medical folks had at that time. In the past 30 years, the medical folks have kind of watered down, I don't know if that's a politically correct term or not, but they have changed their criteria, all right? They've changed it to now encompass, a broader spectrum of people. So, but 30 years ago, these kiddos that are highly verbal would not have been labeled as falling under the autism spectrum. But now they are, because that criteria has changed significantly. Educationally, we didn't even have a special education label for autism until like the mid-90s. These students were in our schools, teachers, we were just calling them something else, all right? Whether we were calling them CD, whether we were calling them EBD, other health impaired, or, just funny kid, quirky, unusual kid, who knows? But they were in our schools. We didn't have a special ed label for autism, and we do nowadays, all right? And we have educational criteria that we look at to determine does the child meet the Wisconsin, criteria for an impairment of autism. We have that just like for kiddos with learning disabilities, cognitive disabilities, speech and language, visual, etc. There is now one for autism. So that alone has greatly broadened the number of people that have now been identified with autism spectrum disorder. I think another contributing factor has been increased awareness to this particular developmental disability, more so than any other developmental disability. And I do think it started with Rain Man. I mean, it was kind of like when that movie came out, it was kind of like, wow, what is this thing called autism? And everybody, I think they were just kind of like, this is amazing, this autism. Since then, there is so much by the media on autism. It's like I can hardly open, my homepage on my internet, CNN.com, without seeing autism somewhere. Something about autism. It's been the cover story of Time and Newsweek. I can't even tell you how many times in the last so many years. And TV shows are jumping on the autism bandwagon. You know, they all have characters nowadays that have autism. You don't see this with Down syndrome, all right? We're not seeing this with CP. It's like autism is the hot disability right now. So I think because of everyone's increased awareness and understanding, I think folks are being more readily identified with autism spectrum disorder. And I'm starting to wonder, is this pendulum, you know, starting to swing really far over? All right, you know, like the ADHD, remember a few years ago, like every single student, you know, with that pendulum, every single student had ADHD. Because I'm finding educationally now, because of educators' increased awareness and understanding, I'm getting so many referrals for students that are just shy, quiet kids, okay? And I'm like, can you not be shy and quiet anymore? Like, people automatically are thinking, oh, they must have autism because they only have 2 friends. I'm like, you can't just have 2 friends anymore, all right? So, you know, and autism is not being shy and quiet, all right? Autism is neurologically struggling in the area of social relations. And I'm going to define what I mean, all right, so that you have a better understanding, because I don't want you to think a shy, quiet student that mainly, you know, only has a couple of friends has autism. That is absolutely not the case. So that's, you know, these 2 factors alone I can definitely speak to as to why we are seeing so many more students identified with ASD in our schools. Is it treatable? I get asked this question all the time because people keep saying, well, you keep saying it's neurological, so is it kind of like it is what it is? You know, this is what we have. And I'm like, absolutely it's treatable. And as long as the educators, all of us educators understand how neurologically it impacts these students so that we can instruct them according to their very unique learning style. And secondly, give them instruction in the very unique learning need areas that they have. And I'm not talking academics, people, all right? I'm not saying they don't need academics, yes, but they also need instruction in, like I said with Alex, like social relations, self-regulation, communication, how to be a more flexible thinker. We're going to need to teach them those skills. So we can do some neurological rewiring as long as we're giving them that instruction. But if we don't give that instruction, they're not going to change, all right? This is going to remain the same. I've had people say, well, is it curable? Can you, like, you know, you're cured, you know, of your autism. Well, you know, I said it's a neurological processing disorder, so they can certainly make lots of progress and be very, very, you know, productive, you know, citizens in society, but when I say they're cured, and I would say most professionals would say, no, it's not a curable developmental disability. How many of you have heard of Temple Grandin? All right, probably about half of you. If you've not heard of her, this is a person you are going to want to check out, people, let me tell you. She is, she has taught me so much about autism because she has autism. Temple is in her mid-60s now. She has her PhD in designing animal livestock holding facilities. It's like whoever thought you could go to college and specialize, you know, in that. But anyway, and she's a world authority in her field. I'm telling you, world authority in her field. Sought after tremendously for her skills in her job. She also travels around and speaks about what it's like to have autism. And I've heard her speak a number of times. In fact, she's going to be the keynote speaker in May at the Autism Society of Wisconsin State Conference. And every time I hear Temple speak, I learn more and more what it's like to have autism, which helps me understand my students so much more. She has written a number of books, resources. Some are like her life stories, some are a bit more technical. But let me tell you, if you get a hold of any of her resources, they are exceptional.